The ecological destruction that Florida's homeless camps is having on the environment is unimaginable. And on today's video, we're going to talk about these homeless camps. From beautiful tropical islands to the destruction of mangrove sanctuaries, these areas in Florida are unique to the state, and nowhere else in the continental USA will you find the climate, vegetation, or types of life that exist in the state of Florida. However, these sensitive environments that are endemic only to Florida are being destroyed at a rate that will never be able to bounce back naturally. So, what is exactly the problem in Florida? And why, if these homeless camps exist throughout the entire United States, is it a particular problem for Florida? The issue arises that the vegetation zones that are found within the state of Florida are found nowhere else in the United States. And ecologically, these mangrove swamps are not really a large area. The species and animals that live in these swamps are endemic only to Florida within the United States, and nowhere else in the country do the same vegetation or animals exist. And currently, these habitats are being threatened by homeless camps. And there's many other factors as well, like the limited fisheries, the red tide, and other sources of contamination that are destroying Florida's ecology, as well as unprecedented events like Hurricane Irma, which had a 14-foot storm surge that undoubtedly caused massive ecological damage to southwest Florida. But beyond these natural disasters, homeless camps themselves are a particular and massive destructive force that's gripping the state of Florida. And because of the state's stance on homelessness, the people that are homeless are venturing deeper into the woods and farther increasing their presence in ecologically sensitive areas, many of which are preserved. And these areas have wildlife that, again, is endemic only to Florida. If the state had a different approach to homelessness, then perhaps these people wouldn't be forced to live in these environments. As city properties and private property are seeing unprecedented numbers of evictions from homeless camps, the people in these camps are forced deeper and deeper into ecologically sensitive areas or the waterways that lead into these ecologically safe areas. And it's turning out that throughout the entire state of Florida, the homeless population is now encroaching on waterways and polluting areas that are environmentally sensitive. The biodiversity of the United States is somewhat uniform throughout the entire country, but there's a few areas where the biodiversity is unique to that region. The species that inhabit Florida's coastlines are found nowhere else in the United States. And not only do these wildlife enclaves have a destructive force from humans attacking them, there's also non-native species, which means that Florida's unique habitat, unique biodiversity, and environments, as well as vegetation, are all being destroyed at a rate that's unprecedented. And these homeless camps encroaching on these sensitive wildlife areas will only accelerate the process of destroying a pristine habitat that's found nowhere else in the United States. When I moved to Florida close to 25 years ago, the narrative about the state was that the Florida panther was a treasure of Florida's natural environment. The narrative about the Florida panther today is that it's a crossbreed and destructive animal that needs to be eliminated, and many people have even lobbied for the eradication of the species protected status. So we can see that even the viewpoint on Florida's ecology has changed drastically in a period of about 25 years, from protection to almost the ideology of eradication. Many people conclude that development itself is a huge destructive force for Florida's native wildlife and vegetation. However, we should note that once an area is cleared of its natural vegetation and it becomes an urban area, if the zoning for that area is adequate with roadways, drainage, ditches, and proper infrastructure, that urban area will be useful for human habitation for many decades. So its ecological impact isn't necessarily adverse, as a place like this, a homeless camp, where there's no real benefit to humans or to wildlife. And what we're seeing in Florida is that these homeless camps have become a dumping ground for chemicals. Some of the items that we're finding in these homeless camps are related to the manufacturing of illicit materials and other destructive substances in volumes that are not habitually found in nature. These homeless camps are a unique source of contamination, whether it's the way they discard their garbage or their human waste. These sites become a toxic biohazard zone. Many of the sites that are undeveloped are becoming homeless camps, and these areas that have high elevation is usually where you're going to find archaeological sites. These sites are being rendered completely useless for future archaeological excavations because of the amount of debris that's being placed over them. Even when local officials clear these sites and haul away the superficial debris, many times these homeless camps will bury their garbage, leaving behind contamination that is not easy to eradicate. Florida's aquifers, as well as Florida's composition of sand, is unlike what you see in other parts of the country. Here in Florida, most of this contamination will stay at a surface level, while other parts of the country have soils that are able to regenerate. This sand in Florida does not have the property to be able to regenerate these contaminations, which means that once an area becomes contaminated in Florida, that contamination stays stagnant in that place for centuries to come. There simply isn't enough organisms in the ground here in Florida to biodegrade or dissolve these substances. It is simply sand, and underneath the sand, there's nothing but more sand. In most places, biodegradation happens in layers of the ground. Here in Florida, the rain washes everything away into the ocean. Simply put, the environment and topography of Florida does not lend itself to recycling or regenerating these contaminations. Simply, it just gets washed away into the waterways, which then leads into the oceans. Florida's landfills have leach fields that focus on extracting the bleeding from these landfills. And while many of these landfills' leach fields are actually ineffective, nobody's gone to document that. We would assume that in theory, these Florida landfills would prevent leaching from contaminating the adjacent waterways. Of course, that doesn't really happen unless you have a site that has an incinerator. If it's an actual landfill, chances are, despite all the measures taken, you still have a level of leaching or runoff from the landfill into the surrounding environment. But a homeless camp like this that creates a massive open landfill does not have that protection, and leaching of contamination into the environment is literally unavoidable. And in Florida, we don't have dirt with worms and lots of leaves. We literally just have sand. The only thing that can happen is contamination of leaching and runoff into the adjacent waterways. And because of waterway destruction due to development, you already have the aquifers bleeding to the surface in places where it was not expected, causing a somewhat contamination of sulfurs and other substances that should have been lower in the ground level below the limestone. That is now being brought to the surface. Combine that with the chemical runoff, and now you're pushing a destructive slime. You may have heard the Florida Everglades being described as the river of grass, and that is exactly how Florida's environment biodegrades anything. This river of grass is one of the most environmentally sensitive areas in the United States, and it doesn't take too much to upset this natural system. The destruction that these improvised homeless camps are having on Florida's ecology will be one that will torment the following generations for decades to come, as there is really no solution to this massive volume of pollution that is entering our waterways thanks to these massive homeless camps that are now present in most counties in Florida. Many counties having as many as over 100 homeless camps that are increasingly being pushed to the edge of these waterways as they find ways to hide from law enforcement. For generations to come in Florida, there will be no fishing. There will be no going to the creek. The creeks are full of needles, the waterways are littered with debris, and the water that's getting pushed into the back bays and into the estuaries is contaminated, causing red tide and other contamination that has pretty much destroyed Florida's waterways. Beaches that were once clear and pristine are now a slime of contamination, from the Florida Keys to Southwest Florida into the mangroves of Tampa. Really, all over Florida, what was once pristine coastal preserves are now becoming a slime of death. The water smells foul. The contamination, even if it's removed from the surface, has leached into the sand. The palm berries that are natural food for birds and black bears are being harvested by the people in these homeless camps, and that eliminates natural food sources for species. Everything that these homeless people drag into these camps is chemical, harmful, and toxic. Ecological imbalances take place when, for example, they leave containers out in the open that become breeding ground for mosquitoes in times of the year when this normally doesn't happen. And because predators cannot reach these sites, they're supposed to be happening in creeks and other bodies of water, not in containers, means that the explosion of mosquitoes at times of the year when it's unprecedented with absolutely no natural way to control it is causing entire ecological imbalances. And while I'm just taking a theory out there, the fact that these are contaminated sites means that there could possibly be mutations in these animals due to the harmful chemicals that are present in these containers. Utilities that are meant just for rainwater are busted open and used as septic fields, pushing large volumes of human waste that's been untreated directly into the waterways. On our channel, we've documented this in Lee County, Polk County, as well as Orange and Seminole. And I spoke to a utilities worker for Brevard County, and he told me that is happening there as well. These homeless camps are breaking the storm drains for natural water flow and are using them to dump their untreated human waste directly into Florida's waterways. In these and many more ways that we don't have time to elaborate, these homeless camps are causing a massive ecological destruction to Florida, an environment that exists nowhere else, that can't be duplicated, and the animals are left to suffer in the slime of contamination that we humans have created and dumped into their home. Many of the people that live in these homeless camps are addicted to a lot of substances, and we as humans get to see the evidence of their destructive force in our communities, like these liquor stores that were broken into adjacent to a homeless camp. But what we don't get to see is what happens when these homeless camps start to destroy the natural habitat of the animals, when the gopher tortoises are killed, when the gopher tortoises are eaten, when contamination and raw human untreated waste is put into storm drains and it washes away into our waterways. Much of the destruction that these homeless camps cause is still secret. However, those of us that are familiar with and fond of Florida's natural vegetation and its unique natural settings are aware that these homeless camps are causing a massive ecological destruction, and that the generation to come won't be able to play in the creeks because they'll be full of needles. There won't be redfish and sea trout in the estuaries because they would have died off. So next time you go to a Florida beach and wonder why there's dead fish on the shore, why the water smells bad, or why you can't breathe along the coast, remember that these sources of contamination far inland are being pushed by the waterways into the ocean, and that the destruction that we're causing far inland in these homeless camps is one of the contributing factors to Florida's ecological nightmare. Large communities run their sprinklers all night, and this water from deep below rises to the surface to keep their golf courses green. Others blame the agricultural industry. However, overlooked is the fact that nearly 100,000 people are transient in these Florida homeless camps, and that population rises during the winter. These homeless populations in the state of Florida, every year the estimate is less and less, but us on the streets of Florida are aware that every year homelessness is actually increasing. Despite that, the analytics are pointing to a decrease in the homeless population. The county that we live in now, Manatee, only reported 185 homeless people. However, a drive through the city of Bradenton alone, you can see 300 to 400 homeless people on a given day vagrantly sleeping on the streets. Clay County, Florida reports less than 30 homeless people in their entire county. However, we discovered that on the outskirts of Clay County, the homeless people that are transient in Clay have to go sleep in Duval County. The solution that most of these Florida counties are offering to homelessness is simply to push them out of one place and watch them move into another. But every single time they move, they contaminate a new site. And while the jurisdictional obligation is no longer their problem, the contamination that's in the state of Florida will continue to be our problem. The residents of Florida are going to be dealing with this problem for decades to come, as one of the most destructive ecological activities that has ever taken place on the face of this land is currently taking place. Once the homeless people are evicted and they move on to an adjacent county or district, the problem is gone. But the contamination that these homeless camps leave behind will be with us for decades to come. No effective studies in the state of Florida have been done on the actual homeless population and the ecological destruction that these homeless camps are actually having in the state of Florida. But if you want to contribute to another possible cause of the red tide, add to that list 100,000 people living in homeless camps, busting open stormwater drains to use them as raw sewage dumps, burning plastics and leaving behind one of the largest destructive trails. Sure, the adjacent businesses can see the signs like broken into windows because of being adjacent to these homeless camps. But when we go to the beach and we see the dead fish, remember that one of the likely causes of the red tide could just be the vast number of chemicals that are being dumped into these homeless camps and the amount of raw human waste that these homeless camps are dumping into our waterways. And when people in the future dig for archaeological artifacts, they're not going to find dinosaurs. They're going to find needles. They're going to find lighters. They're going to find all of the destruction left behind these homeless camps and wonder what exactly happened to human civilization in this particular time period that caused so much destruction. Could you imagine what the archaeologists of the future are going to think when they dig up a homeless camp and see the things that humans were ingesting into their bodies? Addiction is not only destroying the lives of those people who engage in these activities, but it's also putting our lives in danger every time we drive on the roads and every time we go to the beach and wonder, why does it smell like dead fish? Why are the fish gone? Why are the manatees dying? Just remember that somewhere out there, 100 homeless people in Polk County, Florida, busted open a storm drain and are using it as a public bathroom, and that's flushing right into the waterways that lead to our beaches. The amounts of contamination and the vast number and quantity of chemicals that are used in these homeless camps, both for their addictions and just for their nasty habits and destructive path, is difficult to understand, but we can assume that just like this sidewalk here in Pasco County has human waste on it, so do our waterways. A problem that's been covered up and ignored in Florida, and it could be an explanation to why we're having the red tide, why we're having this unexplainable destruction. We still haven't got a concrete answer to why the red tide is now just a constant factor instead of a transient thing that happens naturally. It's become an ever-present factor in our waterways of Florida. And as somebody who fishes the Gulf of Mexico, I can tell you that at least in Southwest Florida, the waterways that I've been familiar with my whole life, less than 30% of the biomass of fish is left. Alright guys, and that is the massive ecological impact that these homeless camps are having on the state of Florida. As we know, most of the absolute worst ecological destruction happens in the poorest parts of the world. But when a large percentage of the population in the United States is now living in squalor, in shanty towns, in quote-unquote homeless camps, we can assume that here, in these pristine landscapes found nowhere else in the world, despite being the wealthiest country, we too are now having third world problems When I go into the woods in Florida, I want to see bear droppings, not human droppings. I want to see a deer running through the woods, not a crackhead. And I want to see snails and other natural forms of life when I go to the beach, not the carcass of a dead fish that died from the red tide. And if I ever have children one day, when I take them to the beach or to a park, I want them to fish for bass, not for needles. But for many in Florida, the environment just isn't important. Just remember that without this natural beauty, South Florida is nothing more than the Mississippi coast. Make sure you guys subscribe to our channel. We have just reached 100,000 subscribers. And even though we get 100,000 views every 2 days, we only have 100,000 subscribers. It means that the vast majority of people, while they enjoy watching my content, just simply don't want to support me. Even though they're slow, they want to run fast and go watch the major news sources, but they don't want to subscribe to our small channel and support local Florida business. Now, these are the types of folks that say they have really tough skin and they don't get offended easily, but when I put on one of my videos, whoo, man, do they cry and complain. Ain't that ironic? Well, they'd rather run off and watch CNN, see nothing, know nothing. And don't get me started on Fox News. Hey, you've heard the old saying, never trust a fox. The cunning of the fox is as murderous as the bite of the wolf. Don't get me started on MSNBC. They got a bunch of letters but no numbers. NBC 2, never been correct 2 times. But then there's Southern Life. You may not like me. I gotta change that name. That crap is weird.